Okay, can you hear me in the back? Okay, cool. So yeah, I'm gonna help Professor Han to finish the very last class for the CS412, which is basically trying to wrap up the class analysis part. And do all of you know about the coverage of this section in the final? I think someone told me about that some discussion is happening on Piazza. They're asking about the coverage of this section, this chapter in the final. Like, is everyone clearly about it? So I think Professor Han told me that out of the section, except for the evaluation of clustering, will be covered in the final. I mean, so the density and the group-based method that I'm going to talk about today will also be covered in the final. Okay. So yeah, let's start. I believe last time when I was here, I talked about the partitioning-based method for cluster analysis. In particular, I talked about some extensions to the k-means algorithm when the outlier could possibly be a problem, and people seek the solutions to make the algorithms more robust. They try to leverage the medium, the midpoint, and other kinds of new definitions to the central point of the cluster to try to modify the k-means algorithm. And I kick off the discussion on the hierarchical methods, including the bottom-up and top-down paradigms for grouping or dividing the data points to different clusters, so that you can have a hierarchical view of the data points. And the benefits of doing hierarchical clustering versus the partitioning-based method is that you have the own control on the granularity of the cluster, which means you are less biased or sensitive to the outliers in the data sets. But the outlier is still a critical problem in the partitioning-based method, especially k-means algorithm, and that also motivate people to seek the solutions to this. Still the question, how can we better handle the outliers in the data sets? That leads to the design of these density-based and group-based methods that I'm going to talk about today. So, so I will briefly talk about both the density-based clustering and group-based clustering method, including the basic concepts like how to formally define the terminologies in these algorithms. And I will give special discussion on 4 algorithms here. DB-scan, a density-based clustering algorithm, which is a very first density-based clustering method, and then its further extension, Octopus, which is called ordering points to identify clustering structure. And also for the group-based method, I will talk about STING, a statistical information group approach, and click, the group-based subspace clustering. So first of all, what is density-based clustering methods? So remind that in the partitioning-based methods that you have the number of the cluster in mind, which is k, and you're trying to partition the data points into k different groups, where you're trying to make sure each group will be kind of coherent in it, cohesive in itself, trying to be compact itself, and trying to be dissimilar to other clusters. Versus here, the starting point for density-based clustering methods has a slightly different point of view. They're trying to just to identify the dense structure in the data space, or they're trying to have a measure of the density of the data points and use this measure to trying to group things together into small clusters, and then trying to starting from this small dense structure to progressively expand to have a more relaxed dense structure. So, so the critical concepts in these kinds of methods is about how to define the density in terms of different needs. And the major feature for the density-based clustering method is the advantage would be it can discover a cluster of arbitrary shape, and it can handle the noise, because when you have this concept of density, then you also have the ways to deal with those scattered outliers in the data space, because those data points will not be dense in terms of your measures. And also, you can just do one scan over the whole data space to figure out these dense structures, and that will be the benefits of the time efficiency. And the the trade-off of this kind of method is you need to have your own density parameters for those density measures as determination condition. So along this line of methods, I will give detailed introduction to the dB scan and the opticals. And also, there will be other methods also belongs to this category, including the Dan crew, but it's not covered in this lecture. The click will be covered in the group-based method, but I want to make a note here that it's also a density-based method, and later on in the slides we will see why it belongs to both categories. So dB scan basically it's called a density-based spatial clustering algorithm. So the goal of this algorithm is to trying to use the density-based measures on the spatial space of the data points to trying to discover clusters of arbitrary shape. So as I just mentioned, a critical concepts in this kind of method is how do you define density? Usually when we talk about density, we need to have a size of the neighborhoods we are considering, and we also have a number of data points in that neighborhoods to calculate the density. So that leads to the two major parameters of this kind of method. One is the ipsion. The ipsion here meaning that the maximum radius of the neighborhood. If you look at the figure on the top right side here, you can see if we set up the ipsion as 1, meaning that we draw a circle with the radius 1 and see how many data points will be included in that circle. And the second parameter is the minimum number of points in this ipsion neighborhood of a data point. Let's see after we draw this neighborhood for the data point Q here, we will see we can actually count the number of data points in this neighborhood, and we can ask the question that whether this neighborhood has the number of points more than the minimum points or less than the minimum points. Basically, if you have the definition of ipsion and the minimum points, you basically have the threshold on the density of the neighborhood. So the question is how is the algorithm define the minimum points, right? So it's basically actually a tuning parameter for the algorithm. These two parameters needs users to input, and that two parameters together actually define the densities of the cluster you are looking for in this data space. So as you can see here, a brief idea of how this algorithm works is you actually pick a random points in the data space, and you ask the question whether this data point is in a space in a neighborhood that is kind of dense enough. And to answer this question, you actually use this ipsion and these minimum points that are given by the user, and you calculate the density in this circle or this neighborhood. And you will see if this neighborhood is dense enough, this could be a very good starting point for your algorithm, because you're actually quite sure that this data point is embedded in the dense space. And if I do some expansion around this neighborhood of that data point, you probably will get a larger neighborhood which are also dense. Versus if you are reached to a border point, shown in this figure here, you can see the border point, if you calculate its minimum, its number of data points in the epsilon neighborhood, the density actually could be less than the required minimum points that you want, and and the algorithm now knows that it reached to a border, of the data space or the cluster structure. And in particular, for the outlier, if you calculate its density using this epsilon and the minimum points, you will see in most of the case, the outlier will not satisfy the minimum points that you want given a epsilon neighborhood. So that's how the algorithm can work here. Given the two parameters, epsilon and the minimum points, you actually can pick a random point in the data space as the starting point and ask the question that whether the density in the neighborhood satisfy the preset threshold, and if yes, you can do some expansion around this neighborhood to grow the class structure, and if no, you either reach to a border or you are at the outlier of the data space. And at that point, you actually can skip to the next data point in the database or in the data space, and then do the same thing repeatedly. At the end of the day, you will reach all of the data points, but you also will have the class structure that satisfy the density requirement divided by the two parameters. So we can take a close look at some formal concepts or definitions in this DB-scan algorithm. So first of all, what is the directly density reachable here? So we define that a point P here, if you look at the right side, we have this figure here. And now we consider a data point Q and a data point P here. And what is the directly density reachable? So the directly density reachable is saying that a point P is directly density reachable for the point Q if you already give the two parameter epsilon and the minimum points. So if this point P belongs to the epsilon neighborhood of the point Q, which means if the point P falls into the circle, the epsilon radius circle of the point Q, that's the first condition. And also you need to make sure that the point Q's neighborhood, epsilon neighborhood, has the number of data points larger than the minimum points that you require. So there are two conditions. One is asking whether the point Q is sitting in a dense enough space. That's divided by this core point condition. The core point condition basically draw the epsilon neighborhood for Q and then count the number of data points in this epsilon, in this n epsilon Q neighborhood, and then check whether the number of data points in that neighborhood is larger or equal than the minimum points you set. That's the core point condition. And then if Q satisfies this criterion, you also need to look at the data point P and see whether P actually sitting in this epsilon neighborhood of the point Q. And if yes, then basically this tells you that the point P is directly density reachable for a point Q. So the next is density reachable. You see the directly this thing this modifier is taken off, meaning that you have a relatively relaxed criterion to measure what is the density reachable. So the density reachable is defined using the terminology of directly density reachable. It says that a point P is density reachable for a point Q if given this epsilon and the minimum points. If there is a chain of points P1 to Pn such that each Pi plus 1 is directly density reachable for Pi. So if we look at the second subfigure in the right side, you can see P2 is directly density reachable from Q. And if P also is directly density reachable from P2, then this form a chain from Q to P through the bridge P2, and there could be many other data points in the middle, forming a much longer chain. But at the end of the day, you will say the point P actually is density reachable for point Q. So this concept actually, so this is the formal concept that they define what is density reachable. But intuitively, you can see that this provides you a way to expand the cluster structure from a certain data point Q to the other data point P far away, as long as in every intermediate step they are directly density reachable. So this helps you to grow the cluster structure from the very starting point, like the epsilon neighborhood of Q, to a much larger cluster structures, including both Q and point P here. So there's a third concept here, which is called the density connected. Basically means that a data point P is density connected to a point Q given this epsilon and minimum points if there is an intermediate point O such that both Q and both P and Q are density reachable from O. So using this figure on the bottom right side, you can clearly see the idea of what is density connected. So from O, you can reach directly density reach to the other data point as well as another data point, and finally to this data point Q. In a very similar way, you can also starting from the O to another data point and then finally to the data point P. So you can see both P and Q, these two data points, will be density reachable from the data point O, and then we call that data point P and data point Q are density connected. So the reason that people define this density connected, we'll go back to the previous slide, is that what is the density cluster? A formal definition for density cluster is saying that the cluster is a maximal set of density connected points. So this is another way that you can formally define what is density cluster. Or you can also understand in the way that how this cluster is growing or expanding from a small data point and small substructure to a large substructure. Yes? Sure. So I would say I will first actually define what is a core data point. So the core data points here actually has a clear definition by this core point condition. If given the data points and also the minimum points and also the epsilon, right? So you can draw an epsilon neighborhood for data points and count the number of data points in that neighborhood. And if that neighborhood contains a number of data points larger than minimum points, then that is called a core point. So that's how we define core point. The border points actually is kind of vague because data points, if it's not a core point, it could be either a border point, and it could also be an outlier, right? Because both these two kinds of data points are not satisfying the core point condition. But there's not a clear way that you can tell, say, okay, when I look at these points, I know it's either outlier or border. You need to see whether, so I would say the way you can check whether this point is a border point is to check whether it can be reached from some other core points. If it's density reachable from some other core points, then and itself is not satisfying a core point condition, then this data point is a border point. Otherwise, that's the third case. It will be an outlier, because an outlier itself does not satisfy the core point condition. At the same time, it cannot be reached. It cannot be density reachable from any other data points as well. So it's kind of an isolated. So is that clear? Any other questions so far? So that's so I just went through the basic idea of how the DB scan work and some formal definition on how you define the density measures for this algorithm, so that you can run this algorithm given two predefined parameters, which is the epsilon that defines the radius of the local neighbor, as well as the minimum points that actually give you a threshold on judging whether a local neighborhood is dense or not. Right. Yes. So this slide actually give you an overview of how the algorithm works for the DB scan. So at the very first step, you will choose a data points in a random way, and then retrieve for that data points all the points that are density reachable from that selected point P, given the epsilon and the minimum points that are already provided by the user or the algorithm. And as we just talked about, if this point P is a core point, meaning that a cluster will be formed, and then starting from this core point P, using the retrieval process to get other points that are density reachable from point P, you can actually group this cluster into a bigger structure. And if by some chance this point P is an outlier, then basically the algorithm will stop at this. I mean, the algorithm will be done with this point, because there's no other point can be density reachable from point P. So the algorithm will visit the next point in the database or the queue, and then do the same thing again. And also, if this point P is a border point, there's also no other points can be density reachable from point P. And the DB scan algorithm will also try to visit the next point of the database. So the whole process, as you can see, can be categorized into three subcases when they visit a point. The first case is the point P is a core point, and the algorithm can continue by growing the cluster through retrieving all the points are density reachable from the point P. And if the point is an outlier, then the algorithm stop handling this point and will visit the other points. And if the point P is a border point, the algorithm will also stop at this point and try to visit the other data points in the database. So the whole process is continual until all the data points in the database has been visited. And that basically gives you a one scan of the whole database, which is the ON time complexity. But at the end of the day, you will have the class structure for all the data points in the database. So as I just said, because you do one scan doesn't mean you have an ON time complexity for the algorithm, because you also need to do this density reachable operation by computing the distance to all the neighbors. So if you're using a spatial index, the computational complexity could be kind of reduced from to a O n log n, whereas the n is the number of data points in the database. Otherwise, if you're not using this spatial index, the complexity could be O n 2 to the worst case. So here, this example actually shows you that one major limitation of the DB scan algorithm is the sensitivity to the setting of the parameters. So recall that we have two parameters for DB scan. One is the epsilon, basically define the radius of the neighborhood you are looking at. And also you have these minimum points that trying to set up a threshold for what is a density neighborhood. So here you can see the people actually run the DB scan algorithm on the two data space using different parameter settings. So on the upper row, you can see the people set these minimum points as 4, but they changed the epsilons into two different settings. In the subfigure A here, they use the ipsion as 0.5, and in the subfigure B, they use the ipsion as 0.4. So, which means that in the subfigure A here, they actually define a relatively larger neighborhood when they check in this minimum points 4, versus on the figure B, they use a relatively smaller neighborhood when they check in a certain number of minimum points at 4. So, on the other, in the other way of saying this is that they actually have a more restrict requirement on the density in the subfigure B here, and in the subfigure A, they have a kind of relaxed density requirement. But this leads to very different results when the algorithm stops. As you can see on the subfigure B, they actually discover more clusters than the subfigure A here. That's because if using a more relaxed density measures, basically the whole big circle in the figure A here could be a very good cluster. But once you enhance the requirement on the density or forming the clusters, the figure B shows you that they kind of partition this very big cluster into small portions, where a small portion would be representing a more dense substructure, and those substructures form very good clusters instead. Very similar way here. At the bottom, they have three figures corresponding to three different settings of the ipsion, from 5 to 3.5 to 3. This very slight changing of the ipsion actually leads to very different results for the DB-scan algorithm. And that's also one disadvantage of such algorithm. You need to do very fine-tune of the two parameters if you want to get your desirable cluster structure. So any questions so far? Okay. So as I just said, the sensitive to the parameters, it's one disadvantage of DB-scan algorithm, and that also motivates people to try to modify and extend the DB-scan to make it less sensitive to the parameter setting. So one way of doing this is trying to, let's say, can I just rely on one single parameters instead of the two parameters? So the base idea behind these opticals, the ordering points to identify clustering structure, is they're trying to make the algorithm less relying on the ipsion neighborhoods, but just relying on the minimum points, which means they kind of take a minimum points at the hand and trying to use a more flexible way to identify the local neighborhood size. So the observation they have on hand is, say, if user give me a minimum points here, so some higher densities clusters will be complete content in the cluster of a lower density. So basically, if you are given a minimum points at hand, then if you are forming a higher density cluster, if you already have the higher density cluster at hand, and then you're trying to expand the neighborhood size of starting from this high density cluster, you will have a lower density cluster for sure. That means that the higher density cluster is completely contained in the lower density cluster. And this observation actually leads to the interesting idea that in the clustering stage, can we start from these very high density points or very high density substructures, and we process them first, and then we handle those lower density clusters later. So this process actually can be a very nice illustrated in the figures on the right side here. There's some concepts haven't been defined here. For example, the core distance and the reachability distance will be formally defined in the next slide. But here, let's first look at this figure here. So suppose you have a data space like this, and you have some very dense structure, some very loose neighbors there as well. And the y-axis of this figure actually is trying to measure the reachability distance. So the reachability distance in a high-level idea is saying that the distance that can form a epsilon neighborhood with the minimum points of data with the minimum data points in that neighborhood. So it's actually calculating that the density reachability distance to their nearest neighbor, and you can see if with a very low reachability distance, meaning that in the local of that data points, things are become very compact and very dense. That actually form the valleys in this figure, versus on those peak or very high positions, meaning that the data points actually are kind of loosely away from each other. They form a kind of relatively large reachability distance. So the base idea of this optical algorithm is to first looking at the valleys in the data space. They're trying to form this very dense cluster, like corresponding to the bottom of these valleys first, and then they expand into the two sides to handle the remaining parts of the data space. And then now let's look at some formal definition of what is the core distance and what is the reachability distance. So taking the figure on the top right part as an example here, the core distance actually is saying the smallest value epsilon, such that the epsilon neighborhood of the point P has at least the minimum points objects. So if we take in this point P as the starting point, and you set up the minimum points as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, then actually you can draw a lot of different epsilon neighborhoods, like using epsilon prime as 3, or using the epsilon as 6. All of these, the smaller neighborhood as well as the larger neighborhood, and also some even larger neighborhoods, can all satisfy the requirement on the minimum points. But the core distance actually is representing the radius of the smallest neighborhoods that can satisfy these minimum points. So in a formal way, to define this core distance is that if any of the epsilon neighborhoods of the point P has a number of objects smaller than minimum points, then basically the core distance for point P is undefined, because no matter how you tweak this epsilon, how you draw a large circle, if this point P is an outlier or it's a border point, there's no way you can satisfy this minimum points requirement. So there's no core distance at all for this point P. And in the other way, if this point P is indeed a core point, then the core distance is defined as the epsilon, the smallest epsilon that you can draw to have the number of objects larger than minimum point, as this epsilon prime here. So that's the core distance, and the core distance is actually used to further define what is the reachability distance of objects from the other objects. So the reachability distance of an object P from a core object Q is the minimum radius value that makes the P density reachable for the point Q. So again, we look at this figure here. Let's say we already have a core point P here, and we already calculate out what is the core distance for this point P. Let's say we still set the minimum points as 5 here, so you can figure out that this epsilon prime is actually the core distance for the core point P. And then and then you can look at the other data points surrounding this point P and calculate the median radius value that makes the point P density reachable for the point Q here. You can see here you have a Q1 and Q2, but at the end you will see that the median radius value actually is defined in the way that it's the maximum of the core distance and the distance between the point Q and the point P. So, so in the other way, you can see that if the distance between the point Q and point P is larger than the core distance of the Q, then we use this distance between Q and P as the reachability distance. Otherwise, if this point Q is sitting in the epsilon neighborhood of the point Q, then we still use the core distance of the point Q as the reachability distance. So the process of computing this reachability distance will be the O n log n if we're using this spatial index, where the n is the number of the data points here. So again, if we now have this formal definition of the reachability distance, so we can again see that this figure, this figure here, is trying to compute the reachability distance between the data points and its nearest neighbor. So that reachability distance can actually reflect the density of the local clusters. So if the reachability distance is low, meaning that in its local, actually you have seen a very dense cluster structure, and that should be a good starting point for the Optiker's algorithms. So you first look at those several values in the data space, and then process the algorithms to the two sides for those higher position, which represent the higher reachability distance. So the good thing of the Optiker's is actually there's twofold. One is to can handle a broad range of parameter settings while give you a kind of robust clustering results. And then the second thing is it actually can find some hierarchy nested structures, as I will show in these two figures here. So as you can, so the people has run the Optiker's algorithms using two different minimum points settings, but at the end of the algorithm, you see the shape of those clusters are just almost the same. The only difference is they may identify some points as the outlier, some are not outlier. They're using the blue and red color to distinguish between each other. But you can see the major shape of those clusters are still the same. In addition, you will see in these big cluster structures, you will see some smaller substructure with denser local neighborhoods. And these actually are those nested cluster structure can be identified by the Optiker's algorithm. So there's twofold benefits for these Optiker's. One is it's kind of robust to the user input parameters. You are using a minimum points of 4 and using a minimum points of 5 may not make much difference to the results at the end. That's one benefit because user has more flexibility to tune their algorithm, even they are not very familiar with the data sets. And also, because you have these nested cluster structures, you have more information picked out for the data sets. You know, okay, in this customer segment actually have some sub-segments for those customers. That could be one benefit as well. So yeah, before I begin into the group-based methods, any question about these two density-based method, the DB scan and the Optiker's? So I think the reason they put these two algorithms here is first, compared to the partitioning-based methods, the density-based methods actually has a pretty good performance in handling outliers. as the algorithm I just introduced, you can see it actually has very clear definition of what is the outlier point and what is a core point and what is a border point. So outlier is clearly eliminated when forming the cluster structures. But the drawbacks of this very simple DB scan algorithm is the reliance on the two user input parameters. And it's very sensitive to those parameters. And that leads to the design of the opticals algorithm, which trying to eliminate the epsilon parameter. And the result, as you can see, is kind of more robust to a broad range of the parameter setting. Now, the group-based clustering method, from its name, it's actually quite intuitive to see. It's trying to partition the data space. If you think of, let's first think about a 2D space. Maybe you have the age of the customers and the age of the employees and the salary of the employees is 2D space. You're trying to form those rectangles, which is basically the grill here, to partition the data space into, let's say, 100 by 100 cells or 10 by 10 cells. And after you're doing these partitions, the grill-based method is trying to look at each of those small cells and ask the question of whether some cluster will be formed in that cell. And progressively, they're trying to merge those cells together. And when they merge these cells, they also ask whether the clusters in those cells should be further merged to form a large cluster as you merge in the cell. And that's the basic idea of how this group-based clustering work. There are some features, good features, and there are also some challenges of a typical group-based algorithm. The one good feature is that definitely it's efficient and scalable because you kind of partition the data space into some cells. And the number of the cells you're going to get, let's say 100 by 100, you get 10,000 cells, will be definitely much less than the number of data points, maybe millions or billions of data points that you are trying to handle. So you can think it as an approximate way that you're trying to map or transform the data points into some sub-blocks and to handle those blocks in a divide and conquer way. The second actually is the challenges faced by the group-based algorithm is the uniformity. So as you can see, the way you partition the data space into those rectangle groups is a pretty uniform way. What if the shape of the cluster you are handling is very irregular? That meaning using a very uniform view of the group actually will face the challenge of handling those very irregular data distribution. That's one challenge. The second challenge is the locality. So you need to predefine the number of the cells and the cell size and what is the border of those cells and also the density thresholds. You can see there's many customized settings or parameters in these methods. And for identify those local structure, that's the second challenge. And also, the curse of the dimensionality is also one significant challenge faced by the method. Recall that in a 2D space, we can partition those data, the data space into those groups with the rectangles. But once we dive into 3D space, 4D space, or ND space, the number of the cells you're gonna get will be exponential to the number of dimensions, D, let's say, and that actually also lead to some efficiency problem at the end. So along this line, I'm gonna introduce two methods. The first one is called STING, a statistical information wheel approach by Wei Wang and her collaborator from UCLA. It's a RealDB 1997 paper. That's the very first paper on this rule-based clustering method. And the click by Rakesh Agrawal and the other collaborator, they're actually from IBM research. That's Sigma papers in the later year, like 1998. So the click algorithm is both a group-based as well as a subspace classing, which I will introduce shortly. First, what is STING? Is the statistical information group approach. The idea is pretty straightforward. Let's say you have a spatial area, and then you're trying to divide them into these rectangle cells, but you are dividing them at different levels of the resolution. It's pretty similar to the data cube. Let's say at the first layer or the first resolution, you are looking at very coarse cell. So you say, I'm going to partition the whole data space into 4 cells using a very large cell size. But you're also considering further refine these 4 cells into the second layer with a more fine-grained resolution. Let's say for each cell in those 4 cells, I want to further partition them into 4 subcells. So then you have these 16 cells in the second layer with a better granularity, and you do that recursively to the bottom layer or the lower layer where you have very fine-grained cells at the end. So this kind of recursive structure, the benefits is obvious that it's very straightforward for the indexing because you can index in the different granularity, and also you can do some fast operation by aggregating the statistics from the bottom layer to the top layer in a very similar flavor to the data cube operation. So, the core idea of this STING algorithm is saying that some statistical information that you're gonna use to calculate the cluster can be stored beforehand and can be used to answer queries in the later part. So parameter in the higher level cells can be easily calculated from that of the lower level cells. So such kind of parameters, including the count, basically is just the number of the objects in the cells. So it's easy to see that the number of objects in the bigger cells could be aggregated by the number of objects of its subcells or the children cells. And also the mean and the standard deviation, the mean value, the max value, or even some other advanced statistic can also be aggregated and computed in an efficient way. That's also very similar to the data cube setup. And the type of distribution of the data points such the STING algorithm can handle will span from normal distribution to some uniform distribution and something else. The rough idea of how this STING algorithm process when they are given a region query is that they're starting at the root, and then they recursively proceed to the next lower level or the higher granularity level using the STING index. So I'm not going to dive into the details on how those indexing are going to work, but I think this rough idea of the STING algorithm should be captured in this slide. So starting from the root, they proceed to the next level, and when they proceed to the next level, it doesn't mean they exhausted all the children for that cell. The core idea here is they have this notion of what is the similar or the most relevant cell, children cells for this target cell. So they do this relevant cell search by computing the likelihood that a cell is relevant to the query cell using some at a certain confidence level. So because recall that all the statistical information of the every cells in the whole structure has been pre-computed and stored. So this likelihood actually can be very efficiently computed in this recursively top-down stage. So the algorithms will only proceed to the cells that are very likely relevant and doing these things recursively, which means you can see the core idea of the sting algorithm is the approximation. They are not exhausted all the cells when doing this top-down search to set it to answer some query. They only look at the most relevant cells in this stage using some likelihood measures they predefine. This is the advantage, but this is also the trade-off between the efficiency and the accuracy. Since they are using this likelihood-based retrieval process, it means they have to drop some other cells that could be relevant to the query. So the accuracy is actually satisfied in this stage. I mean, if you're doing some exhaustive search, that meaning that you are doing a holistic analysis, you make sure the answers you get is global optimal. But now you are doing some subsampling, meaning that you may only have a local minimum, but you have better efficiency. So because you are doing this stage is query independent, so it's kind of easier to parallels, and you can do incremental update like the cube methods. So all these are the benefits for the space and the time computation complexity. So you will see the complexity is actually okay. The O of k, where k is number of the GRIL cells at the lowest level, and as we just talked about, the number of the GRIL cells is actually much less than the number of the data points. So the whole thing is relatively efficient in this sense. But the disadvantage, as I just talked about, because you're using this probabilities measure, the likelihood to retrieve the most relevant data points, in this process, you will have a loss of accuracies because you are doing some kind of subsampling and approximation. So then a second, so any question before I go into the click algorithm? Okay. The click algorithm is called GRIL-based subspace clustering. So this algorithm is kind of has a mixture of a couple of different ideas that I hope you guys can capture in this slide. So it's still by the same, it's by the IBM people, including the Rakesh Agra. So the click has three characteristics. One is that it's density-based. Second, it's GRIL-based. And the third is it's a subspace clustering. So I will explain in details why, what is these three characteristics. So the GRIL-based means that it's still trying to partition the data space using those GRIL cells idea. And then they estimate the statistical information for each of those cells by counting the number and aggregating the statistics from the bottom to the up. So that's why it's GRIL-based. The density-based meaning that the way they are forming the clusters actually is not doing some partitioning methods, but it's looking at the density measure. So a cluster in the GRIL or in the subspace is a maximal set of the connected dense units in the subspace. So the way they are defining this maximal set of connected dense units, it's kind of very similar to the DB scan. So a unit is dense if the fraction of the total data points contained in that unit exceeds the input model parameter, which is likely also a neighborhood if shown, and the minimum points in that neighborhood. And lastly, why it's also a subspace clustering? Because it looking at first, what is the subspace cluster? It's actually a set of the neighboring dense cells in an arbitrary subspace. We can still use the example of the age and the salary of the employees. You may first dig out what is the cluster of the employees if only looking at their salary. Or you can just look you can just try to class those employees by only looking at their ages. So that can, so either these two tasks, you can use group-based method and density-based method to accomplish. But the subspace clustering, the core idea is how do you looking at different subspace and further merge these subspace. Let's say you're looking at both the age and both the salary to form a more sophisticated cluster by looking at multiple dimension or multiple subspace. So the click algorithm, the magic is it can automatically identify the subspace of a high-dimensional data space that allow a better clustering than just using the original space. And the way they make it work is using this a priori principle. So we can look at a concrete example here, how the click can do the subspace clustering using the a priori pruning. Let's first say we have this 2D space where you have the one of the 1D space is on the salary, the other one is on the edges, the edges. And also you have another dimension is called the vacation, the number of the weeks for their vacation. So in total, you have 3 subspace or 3 dimensions. And the click algorithms will first start at a 1D space. Let's say we pick the salary as the first 1D space. They're trying to partition the salary into several rows and then doing those clustering within each rows. Let's say within the with the salary, you can see the salary between 30Ks and 50Ks will form may form a cluster, and that's for the salary part. So the next step for the click is to find some dense regions in each subspace and generate their minimal descriptions. So not only they are forming this cluster, they also need to pre-compute some of the statistic information for those clusters in this 1D space. So once you have those descriptors, you can further process to the next level, which is you taking the other dimension into account. Let's say you also consider age now when you have this 2D space in total. So in this process, that's where the a priori principle come into play. You can easily compute the merged statistics for this 2D space using those 1D statistical information based on the a priori principles. And you can repeat this process to include more and more dimensions into account, like vacation week, for example. And at the end of the day, you will have a cluster that works for a multiple subspace you are considering. For example, you have the cluster that trying to group the employees using age, salary, and the vacation week all together. So again, the major steps of the click algorithm is first to identify the subspace that will contain the clusters. So the way they are doing this, they first using the rule-based idea, they partition the data space and then calculate the necessary statistic information within each cell. And then they can identify the subspace that contain the cluster using the a priori principle. So next, they use this density-based idea to identify the clusters within each subspace of interest. And then they can use those connected dense units to form the cluster in those subspace. And then next, they generate those minimum descriptor for those cluster in those subspace. And then they recursively do this by involving more and more subspace into consideration. So some additional comments on click. The strength of the click is actually has been shown in the previous slides. First, it can automatically find the subspace of the highest dimensionality, as long as the very high density cluster really exists in those high dimensional subspace. And it's not very sensitive to the order of the record that you are processing, because they are not assuming any canonical data distribution of those data space. And it scales linearly with the size of the input, and also scaled kind of relatively good with respect to the number of dimensions in the data space. One weakness of this algorithm is it's still kind of sensitive to the user input parameters, including the width and the number of the partitions for the group size, because essentially it's still part of the group-based methods. So, any questions about this click algorithm? Yes. So I think the good scalability. So I'm trying to figure out, your question is about why this scales linearly, or because you don't think it's efficient enough. I see. So I mean, because the algorithm works in a way that it merges the dimensions one by one, and I think that intuitively actually explains why it scales linear to the dimension. I mean, once you include a new dimension here, you are not gonna do a computation more than linear operations, and you are not gonna to revisit that dimensions again when you go up to other subspace. Is that explain your problem? Okay, so yeah, we can take it offline. I think it's a very good question. We can talk about it in the office hour, maybe. So I think that's pretty much about these density and group-based methods that I'm supposed to cover today, and it's also included in the final exam. But a very critical part for the classroom is the evaluations. I'm just gonna to quickly, maybe just 2 slides and maybe just 3 minutes, talk about what is the evaluation of clustering. So at a high level, I would say clustering evaluation is still a kind of, there's no totally agreement or complete agreement on what is good clustering evaluation and what is bad. Every person in different applications, they have their own way to evaluate clustering, and some people show this matrix, some people show the set of the other matrix, and some people sometimes may not agree with each other. So the current practice is actually they trying to show a more comprehensive set of metrics, trying to cover a different angle of the clustering. And to evaluate the clustering, actually you have 3 different aspects to consider. First of all, what is the good cluster? So you need to define some measures for a good cluster. For sure, you can use the compactness of the cluster, how the points within the cluster are similar to each other, and how the points across different clusters will be similar to different each other. That's basically like the measure they're using for clustering. And also, the second aspect is the stability of the clustering, because, for example, like k-means, every time you run with different initialization, you will get pretty different results. That's one drawback, and that drawback should also be considered when you're evaluating the clustering results. And the third one is called a clustering tendency. It's basically asking the suitability of the cluster, whether the data has an inherent grouping structure, like some nested structure in those clusters hasn't been digged out. If that case happens, it has a kind of poor clustering tendency. So there's 3 categories of the clustering measures. One is called external, meaning that you actually have some ground truths in mind. For example, you actually know this customer belongs to that segment, So basically, you have a ground truth of those customers on which segments they should belong to, and then you use this ground truth to do the evaluation. That's called external evaluation. But you also can do this evaluation without any ground truth by just looking at how the cluster itself is compact and how the cluster between itself is dissimilar and separated from each other. There's also the third category. It's called relative. It's basically comparing the relatively difference between different clustering results. So I think that's pretty much the high-level idea for doing clustering evaluation. So when you are going to those industry companies and you are doing this clustering things, you actually need to, the most critical things, I would say, one is to know the data sets well before you decide which algorithm to try. And also, you need to have a very good evaluation for the clustering, because at the industry scales, there's no way you can just by looking at the results and say, okay, this is better. First of all, this is just very biased subsample of the data set. And second, companies will not buy your results if you say, okay, I think this is better today, and tomorrow I say that one is better. So you have to have very restrict definition of the evaluation. So this part actually is pretty important for the practical data mining things, but it's a pity that it's not fully covered in this lecture. But I hope you can make some efforts to dig into them by yourself. And that's pretty much about today's class. So I wish you good luck to your final. Thank you.